One was an interview 38 years ago in San Diego, and the second is a complement to that. That was at my retirement party, my farewell address to my staff at Lindbergh Elementary School in Mesa. And the two of them is kind of a more general and less technical expression of my understanding of the Anisa model.
Mm.
So that might be suggested as a good follow-up to this presentation. For anybody interested.
That's intriguing indeed.
Hey.
So I'm just situating here.
We're both wearing blue today.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's pretty cool. I like that.
I do too.
So I see we got people in the waiting room. Jeremiah, you're going to manage that?
Yep, I'm going to manage it.
Okay, great, great, great. And we're live streaming. Beautiful. So Don Streets, Don,
Yes.
very, very happy to be able to have this conversation today. It's going to be, I feel, very productive for all who watch. For all of our presentations, we conduct them through the Clearwater Baha'is. And if people want to know what the next subject is, like the one that we posted for yours, it's always going to be about a week of advance notice on www.clearwaterbaha'is.org. And anyone can go online, they can view, and they can share. So it's really nice because we also have a YouTube channel. So for those that are watching us right now on YouTube, or they're watching us right now on our Facebook page, they can comment and ask questions. And as it goes along, I'll be able to ask you those questions.
Fine.
So it's pretty nice. It's a live stream, so people don't have to they don't have to join on Zoom with us right here. They could join on places like Facebook. And I think that's really important because you know, not everyone knows how to use Zoom. So I'm actually checking the YouTube feed is going right now. Not everyone knows how to use Zoom. So that I had an echo of my voice there. So it's working.
Well,
so I'm sharing this with the folks on Facebook if they want to be able to join. We have different alternatives, you know? So how was your week? How has your time been weathering this coronavirus pandemic?
my week,
Yeah.
it actually has been quite nice. I'm not uncomfortable being by myself, and at this stage of my life, it's given me to begin to reduce the stack of unread books that have been piling up with the best of intentions to get to them at some point. And also, I've been watching some of the older movies I have DVDs of them.
Okay.
And so I've occupied, and of course I have friends who call from time to time.
Which is really nice. It's nice to have that, to be able to, of course, connect with people, and more importantly, to you know, be okay with this situation that we're going through, to be, you know, taking these measures to ensure the safety of the people.
Well, you know, during my lifespan, when I was young, technological magic was putting a carbon paper underneath a sheet of paper with a sheet of paper under it, writing on the top sheet, and then having the mirror image. That was considered unbelievable to a young person like myself at the time. And just look what technology has to offer at this point.
It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, the fact that the medium by which you can display the information, it was, I know, just largely a person who could navigate books best would typically fare the best. Now you have all the information at your fingertips.
Yeah.
So accessibility is now available to so many people. It's amazing.
Well, a couple of years ago, I was in South India visiting a friend, and his father is a manager at one of the big tea plantations. And so I was able to visit some of the most modest hovels where friends of theirs were living. And in every home that we visited, in the corner of the living room was a computer. And the thought that hit me was, for the first time in recorded history, knowledge is accessible potentially to the entire population of the world. That's an extraordinary.
Indeed. I mean, it's not just that, but you have among the largest levels of people who are graduating in history as well.
Yes, right.
So you have so much effusion of knowledge now. It's amazing.
Indeed.
So I've shared for those who are on Facebook to view and join. So we're having more people join in as we speak on both Zoom and on Facebook. I've started a few watch parties, so hopefully for the people who are left out of Zoom, they can join in that way. All right. So with that being done, it is 11:03. We still have people coming in, but Jeremiah's got that handled. I'm going to go through with introductions and get us on our way. So for anybody who wants to know anybody, Dr. Donald Streets. He was an assistant professor at the Center for the Study of Human Potential at the University of Massachusetts, serving as the associate director of the Anisa project. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in business from Indiana University and an MA in school administration from Notre Dame. He received his doctorate at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and has since led many educational institutions from the elementary to the university level, including serving as the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies at National University. Dr. Streets and his wife live in Scottsdale, Arizona. This week's topic today, why we're all here, it is about Anisa, a journey to explore the Anisa model of education. I'm going to ask you, Don, in a few moments to describe the origins of Anisa as we had prior to starting up the feed. I think it'll be very useful. For years, people in the teaching profession have been satisfied with thinking of the curriculum as merely the listing of courses offered by the school. This is understandable, since traditional education has been almost entirely organized around the presentation of factual information with the expectation that a reasonable amount of that information would be retained by the learner and produced when examined. However, in more recent years, the limitation of curricula conceived in these terms has become apparent. Educational systems based on curricula of this kind are inadequate to prepare individuals for the enormous responsibilities of rapidly changing world requirements. Consequently, the call has gone out for a redefinition of education, which requires a new perspective on curriculum development. What is and how it should be modified to meet the needs of a rapidly changing world. Perhaps in no other area of educational reform has there been greater frustration and less progress than in curriculum development. This is partly due to the fact that it has only been within the 40 years, the last 40 years, that educational specialists have regarded curriculum development as a subject of serious inquiry. A second factor in the lack of progress stems from the tendency of curriculum reformers to develop new curricula in the absence of any serious consideration of the nature of the individuals for whom the curricula are being developed. To initiate and sustain significant curriculum reform, however, involves two monumental tasks. One, establishing a philosophical basis which explicates the nature of man, identifying the fundamental propositions which define his nature. And two, using those propositions as means of integrating the body of existing knowledge about human growth and development into a comprehensive theory, which then can serve as a guide to educational practice, including curriculum development. It comes as no surprise, then, that many curriculum theorists, such as Joseph J. Schaub, Arno Bellac, Daniel Tanner, George A. Beauchamp, Jerome S. Bruner, and Arthur W. Fauché, suggest a variety of interim procedures to handle the immediate needs for curriculum change, indicating that the creation of a comprehensive curriculum is unlikely in the near future. Interesting. In spite of this pervasive pessimism, among which writers about the likelihood of a comprehensive theory of curriculum being developed, Arthur W. Fauché and Lois A. Bellin have suggested in the Encyclopedia of Educational Research what such a theory should be able to do. When a comprehensive curriculum theory is built, it will have to take into account not only the learning methods and teaching methods, strategies of instruction and the like, but also the knowledge to be learned, the nature of the student who will learn it, and the nature of societal responsibility shared by the teacher and student. For if education is a moral affair before it is technical affair, then the grounds for moral behavior have to be incorporated in one's theory of educational action. So with that being said, that was an introduction for the topic. And for all of you who are here today, we are speaking with Don Streets. He likes to be referred to as Don, so I'll be referring to him as Don from here on out. I want to ask a question.
Sure.
So, Don, what is Anisa and how did it come to exist?
It's interesting. The word Anisa means tree of life. That's a powerful symbol that's represented in either all or just about every culture that exists today. It symbolizes a tree on a high location that offers nurturance, development, fosters development and learning within the context of shelter and protection. A lot of educational models are either named after an individual or an institution. But the founder of Anisa, Daniel Jordan, felt very strongly that this should not be the case with this new direction in education. That it should bear the name, a title that symbolized the highest hopes and aspirations that are promised by the educational system. And so he used this universal symbol, and I think that was a brilliant, brilliant breakthrough.
That indeed is very interesting. So
for
can you explain?
Baha'is, it might be interesting to know that it's the term that Baha'u'llah used to represent the covenant.
So you gave a description before the talk, before we started, and this is before we went live. Can you explain the origins of Anisa, the name?
All right, it's going to be hard to be brief, so you keep me on task.
Will do.
The founder of Anisa is Dr. Daniel C. Jordan, born in 1932 in a little pokey town in the western section of Nebraska, a city called, or a town named Alliance. He was born in, as I said, in 1932 into a very large working class family. And as you know, that was just the early stages of the Depression. And he was different in one profound respect than his peers in school. He was off the chart brilliant. That became apparent immediately. And so it's not unusual. I mean, it isn't unusual to conceive that after 3 years at in undergraduate at the University of Wyoming, he received a Rhodes Scholarship to study at Oxford. And he is the first American to have received the Rhodes Scholarship in music. At 5 years of age, he started the piano, and he became quite a proficient pianist by the time he was in junior high school. And so he pursued music, and he was headed towards becoming a concert pianist. After being awarded the Rhodes Scholarship, when he got to Oxford, he found that by just donning a robe, he could go to any of the lectures that were available across all disciplines. Well, what does a poor boy from Nebraska do when he doesn't have to pay for every course that he takes? And he has this voracious appetite for knowledge. Well, he went to almost everything, and in the process, almost damaged his health because he was spending so much time going to courses and reading and studying than sleeping. It was at Oxford University that he became reacquainted with the Baha'i faith. And it takes too long to tell, but that was a profound turning point in his life that contributed to his decision to leave music once he finished his master's degree in music from Oxford and start all over at the University of Chicago in the area of human development. And he picked human development because the curriculum at University of Chicago explores the life cycle of human beings from the disciplines of biology, psychology, sociology, and anthropology. It's like getting doctorates in each of those fields. And then after he got his doctorate, he went back and he studied sequence in brain chemistry, brain structure, and their relationship to learning and memory. And then he set about as a new professor at Indiana State University, working on the Anissa model. In 1968, Dwight Allen became dean of the School of Education at the University of Massachusetts, and he invited Dan to join the group there that Dwight had decided that what was needed in education was an educational revolution. And that was a continued site where Anissa was able to thrive during the excitement of that period. The country was filled with optimism and hope and that sort of thing. And so Dan Jordan attracted a number of graduate students who jointly assisted him in developing the Anissa model. But I have to say this one last thing in this brief introduction of Dan, and that is there were many people who contributed to the development of Anissa. But it must be acknowledged that the major theoretical and philosophical concepts that represent really a breakthrough, a substantial imperative breakthrough in education, came from the genius of the mind of Daniel C. Jordan. And so anything that I say is a reflection of what I learned. And I had the luxury of being 14 years with the project. So as I struggled to learn what will be shared today, I had the opportunity of hearing Dan speak on hundreds of occasions. And so you will be hearing what portion penetrated this brain and this understanding.
Thank you very much. So, so for everyone who wants to know, Anisa comes from Tree of Life. For anyone who missed that, that's a very interesting development where you have the normal understanding that usually you'll have someone's name associated with an educational model. Anisa is coming from the origins of Tree of Life. And that's very intriguing to me, to say the very least.
Mm. Well, this first slide, investigation of life, it didn't take very long for Dan to realize in his conceptualization and trying to integrate all this vast knowledge that he had acquired from the various disciplines, that because humans are both the subject and the object of education, the beginning place was understanding the nature of the creature for whom the educational system is being organized. And in order to do that, an exploration had to be made into the entire history of the accumulation of thought that humans have engaged in, that scholars have engaged in, about who we are as human beings and where we fit into the grand scheme of things. And for decades, curriculum theorists struggled to create a comprehensive theory of development, a comprehensive theory of teaching, a comprehensive theory of evaluation. And they failed. And the best of those who were involved in that process says, forget it. It's too complex and it's impossible to achieve in the short run. But Dan just found that to just look at human development is insufficient to solve that problem. What we must look at is a broader, wider scheme of thought. And that has to do with mankind's best thinking about the nature of who we are as human beings. That led to an exploration by Dan and then by the staff of over 2,000 years of recorded history, predating Plato and Aristotle down to the present process philosophers. And that was no small undertaking. We had to know, what's our purpose? Why do we exist? In different ways, either by implication or explicitly, humans have asked this question: who are we? How did we get here? What's the purpose of our existence? Where are we headed? Where are we on the trajectory of evolution? We, our scholars in anthropology, have identified different stages through which humans have gone. There was a time when we were indistinguishable from other animals, but there was something within the human species in potentia that did not exist in other forms of especially animal life. And that has made all the difference. And what religion has told us down through the millennia is that that difference is the human soul characterized by the gift of understanding. And so existence out there is in layers, the lowest being the physical or material ontological layer, which the major characteristics is cohesion. The atoms and molecules kind of cling together. It's a very powerful characteristic. To release that bond is what an atomic explosion is all about. So that gives us somewhat of a metaphor for understanding how strong the bond of cohesion is. The next level is the vegetable level. It contains minerals, but it also has the characteristics of photosynthesis, the ability to bind energy from the sun and grow. And then above the vegetable is the animal level with the five senses and the power of movement. But when it comes to the human level, even though we possess so many of those characteristics of lower ontological levels, there's a difference. God, in his wisdom, decided to endow us with the capacity for consciousness, for thought, for learning, and for memory. Interestingly enough, Abdu'l-Baha identifies the major characteristics of the soul as being those qualities: comprehension, thought, consciousness, thought, comprehension, and memory. And those are the tools we use in our aspirations for fathoming the unknown, the yet to be learned information, as well as the ultimately unknowable things that we speculate about because of this wonderful gift of consciousness of the soul. As an example, some of you may have visited the Vatican, and if you have, you were shown the Sistine Chapel, that magnificent painting by Michelangelo. It shows man stretching and reaching up towards God, as well as God reaching down towards man. But there's that little, I say, that little stinking gap between the two. We cannot know God directly, but what God has given us is the capacity to make a magnificent hypothesis, namely that there is such an entity as deity. In our case, we're talking about the ontological levels of the manifestation of God that's above man, and then above that, God himself, or what Baha'is refer to as the unknowable essence. And so we can reach there. We have to take the first step. We have to make the effort. And there will be a quote that comes up pretty soon that is from the Baha'i writings that describes that. We have to make that assumption, which then is like it is a magnificent hypothesis. And through that process, we now are able to scientifically structure an approach by acting in accordance with that assumption, which gives us the personal data to affirm the legitimacy of that assumption of the existence of God. And so when I read in the Baha'i writings that the Baha'i approach is essentially scientific in its approach, I really got excited because here's an example of where science and religion work hand in hand. Two areas that historically, even today, the proponents are at odds with one another. Here's a lovely picture of a very dear friend of mine, Dr. Elena Moscatova-Poussard, who's written volumes on the phenomenon of consciousness, and she has pioneered the field of spiritual psychology. In some of her writings, I was able to read her definition of consciousness, in which she says that consciousness is the function, it's the result of an internal dialogue between mind and heart, guided by volition or willpower. We just can't lie on a chaise lounge and say, okay, God, zap me and prove to me that you exist and tell me what to do. We can't have it both ways. We can't say, God, why do you let children suffer? Why do you allow humans to engage in warfare and all the horrible things that humans have done to one another? If he has given us and trusted us with the phenomenon of human consciousness, then the ball is in our court to struggle to, in the words of the Guardian, gain a clearer apprehension of God's purpose for mankind. And we must, this implies very strongly that learning must take place, and the faculties of the soul that were just mentioned, among which is consciousness, has to be drawn upon to then make the struggle. And we talk with ourselves. Thinking is talking to ourselves. And we engage in this internal dialogue between mind and heart, guided by volition or the ability to choose to do so. If we should choose not to do so, that in itself is a choice. So we're on the hook. And either way, we are responsible for our choices, and to aid us in that process necessarily involves and requires a powerful educational system. It's interesting that the word education comes from the Latin word educo, which means to draw out, not stuff in. So much of traditional education has to do with stuffing in information. Well, a recent check with the Library of Congress, you know, they record new information every time it's discovered. Recently, I think 4 or 5 years ago, when I checked, knowledge, the sheer volume of knowledge is now doubling every 8 months. So if that's the case, any educational system that is based on storage and retrieval of information is intrinsically defective, inherent, inferior. What's needed now is how is that information accessed, and what can we do with the information, with the facts that we gain in caring for the ever advancement of civilization. The brilliant scholar, Julian Huxley, you know, the Huxley family is a pretty decent gene pool. Aldous Huxley is the author, of course, of Brave New World. But Julian Huxley is a biologist. He said because of the human capacity for cosmic self-awareness, man in the evolutionary process is now in the enviable position of taking charge of the most important work in the universe, namely guiding evolution, not just being a subject of evolution, but now being able to understand the nature of evolution and what's involved, and then to take charge of that process and to create that advancement. Somebody once said, there are people that make things happen, there are other people that have things happen to them, but then there's a third group that just wonder what happened. Well, so far humanity's kind of in the second and third, well, in the third category. We need, as a humanity, the educational system and the inspiration and the motivation to accept where we are in the trajectory of evolution, to actually understand evolution to begin with, and then take charge of that process. And that involves the integration and the understanding of our purpose. I think we have a slide that deals with purpose. Maybe you can read this, that affirms what I've said so far, I believe.
Sure. To every discerning and illumined heart, it is evident that God, the unknowable essence, the divine being, is immensely exalted beyond every human attribute, such as corporal existence, ascent and descent, egress and regress. Far be it from his glory that human tongue should adequately recount his praise, or that human heart comprehend his fathomless mystery. He is and hath ever been veiled in the ancient eternity of his essence, and will remain in his reality everlastingly hidden from the sight of men.
You know, we refer to the direct words of the various manifestations of God, the words from Buddha, Zoroaster, Krishna, Christ, Muhammad, and now Baha'u'llah, as the creative word. And during one class, when we were discussing this, I asked the class members, what does it mean, the creative word? And the one offering that really has stuck with me, that is a powerful metaphor, at least as far as my understanding is concerned, is this person said, the creative word is like time release medication. It's spiritual time release medication. You can read something from the writings of Baha'u'llah, or from the Bible, or from the Upanishads, or the Kabbalah, the mystical teachings of Judaism, and think, well, yeah, I got that. And then a few weeks later, read the same thing, and suddenly something happens that embellishes, doesn't contradict necessarily, but embellishes that understanding. We were going to get to why the Anisa model came to rest on the writings of Alfred North Whitehead. I'll pick up on that point at that time. Could you read this,
Yes.
Statement about the deity ontological level?
O Son of Being, love me that I may love thee. If thou lovest me not, my love can in no wise reach thee. Know this, O servant. O Son of Man, veiled in my immemorial O Son of Man, veiled in my immemorial being, and in the ancient eternity of my essence, I knew my love for thee. Therefore I created thee, and have engraved on thee mine image, and revealed to thee my beauty.
The Anisa model, like no other educational system that I've been exposed to, has acknowledged a reality about us as human beings that is crucial, and that is the learning capacity, which we label as volition. Volition is the ability to intend to do something and follow through to completion. They say American attics are filled with uncompleted projects. There are tons of educational programs that are being carried out where unwittingly, in the ignorance of knowledge about the volitional capacities of human beings, what enhances and fosters them and what precludes them. In the ignorance of that, we unwittingly impair the volitional capacities of human beings. One way to do that is implicit in a very popular book by Steinbeck. Was it Steinbeck? No. I'm blocking on the name. Anyway, it's a book, C.S. Lewis. A book by C.S. Lewis in which he tells about an experienced devil who's worried about his nephew who's going in the right direction rather than the wrong direction. So he sends him a series of letters to get him off the pathway of righteousness onto the path of leading towards perdition. And in one of them, he said, the best way to ensure the triumph of evil over good was to get people to have noble intentions and then not act on them. He said the effect immediately is to have difficulty generating the noble intentions. And if you keep having noble intentions and not acting on them, you reach a point of just being numb. You're immobile, you're paralyzed. What do we do in public schools? The teacher is terrified that the principal will come by and see the kids off task. So in ignorance of volitional competence, what fosters it, what precludes it, teachers will plan lessons that are impossible to be completed during the time allotted during the school day. So students go through an entire day starting lessons, but being interrupted and told to finish them later to go on to the next lesson. And then we wonder why by mid-morning, they're bored and they're doing all kinds of crazy things. If you really want to frustrate and paralyze the actions of an individual, disallow that person the delight of completing a task. And there is research that shows clearly that when a task is completed, especially if it's completed with distinction, there's an actual impulse sent to the pleasure center of the brain, and it's subjectively experienced by delight, happiness, and a release of energy. When we make a decision, the mind takes whatever energy is available to it and puts it in kind of an intellectual lockbox, only to be spent for that particular thing. Even if you forget that you've decided to do it, that energy is no longer available to the person. So a person who makes a lot of decisions and then doesn't act on them creates a horrendous motivational problem for himself. And teachers have unwittingly induced that in students without knowing the literature on volitional competence. Well, that's the major category of learning, which we'll see later on in the learning paradigm of the Anisa model. Now, this particular set of questions relates to the beginning place of Anisa. It didn't take long that a broader scheme of thought than just development or just curriculum or just evaluation was necessary to create a comprehensive system. And so that led into, as I said before, over 2,000 year exploration into the best thinking that humans have engaged in about who we are as human beings, looking at both Eastern and Western strains of philosophical thought. And in his explorations, beginning at Oxford and then later on, Dan Jordan ran into the works of Alfred North Whitehead, a mathematician, logician. He actually was Bertrand Russell's teacher, the famous mathematician, who in his early 60s was attracted away from Cambridge, Massachusetts to Cambridge, away from Cambridge, England, to Cambridge, Massachusetts to take up a chair in philosophy at Harvard University. And it's in that, during that period that he devoted his brilliance and his knowledge to the exploration of philosophy. Philosophy is divided into two categories. There's critical philosophy, which only accepts as actual or real that which can be perceived through the five senses. Because of a paradigm shift in the late 1800s, during which the mechanistic tradition heralded by Sir Isaac Newton and held reign for over 2,000 years, dominating the hard sciences, where only that which is perceived through the senses is accepted as reality, was toppled by the emergence of process philosophy through the acknowledgement, first of all, that reality can also be non-actual. They found that an idea or an ideal can have effects and therefore is real. And that led to it's a much larger discussion and so on, and it takes a mind greater than mine from the hard sciences. But that was a major shift in thinking of humanity. And it involves higher cortical functioning and a recognition that a concept a reality can be created from a non-material source. When B.F. Skinner, the father of behaviorism, whose psychology is based on mechanistic reductionistic thinking, was a new professor at Harvard University, just having received his own doctorate from Harvard, and was the father of behaviorism, got himself seated across from Alfred North Whitehead, and he was eager to explain his theory of operant conditioning. And Whitehead listened intently at this dinner, and then when he finished, he said, "Mr. Skinner, then explain the behavior that's just about to happen." He said, "The scorpions are falling from the ceiling on the table." And Skinner thought the old guy had just kind of flipped out. And then Whitehead explained. He said, "I've never said that before." He said, "In fact, 90% of what anybody says during the course of a day, he or she has never said in exactly the same way. How can you say then that all behavior is the result of reinforcement? Because reinforcement implies that it had to pre-exist before it can be reinforced." And then other scholars offered that the phenomenon of intentionality cannot be adequately explained through behaviorism. So that left Skinner sputtering, and he went back to the drawing boards and he wrote one of his monumental books called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, in which he tries to explain the phenomenon of language and creativity through behaviorist theory, and he failed miserably. So behaviorism is a tool, but it's a very limited tool. Here's Whitehead. And that's the works that, not as an ending place, but as a beginning place to conceptualize this broader frame of reference about the nature of who we are as human beings. And the reason Whitehead was picked by Dan Jordan is because he found that Whitehead's cosmology, which is represented in his monumental text called Process and Reality, represents a unique synthesis of both Eastern and Western philosophical thought. We had to make a beginning someplace, and this seemed to be a rich source, a basis for beginning the process, to gain some semblance of an understanding of who we are, how we got here, what is our potential, what is the process by which that potential can be released or actualized. Can we go on to the next slide? These are the questions that were asked. And in that philosophy and in philosophy, process philosophy in general, the beginning place is our purpose. And from the Baha'i writings, there are 4 magnificent interrelated aspects of purpose that are mentioned. By Baha'u'llah, he said, our purpose is to know and worship God. Abdul Baha said that our purpose is to acquire virtue. That's what we do as individuals as we struggle to know and worship God. The guardian of the faith, Shoghi Effendi, said that our purpose is to achieve the oneness of mankind. And then Baha'u'llah again said that our collective purpose is to carry forward the advancement of civilization. Everything issues forth from purpose. Now, somebody superficially viewing these things, you think, well, why don't they get together? These are different dimensions of the same phenomenon. Some apply to us as individuals, and others include that, but apply to our collective effort as a corporate entity, body on this dust heap of a planet called Earth. And so everything about the actualization of who we are as human beings must ultimately justify its existence on the basis of these 4 statements of purpose. Are we engaged in the worship and the struggle to know God? Are we struggling to acquire virtue? Collectively, are we working towards the oneness of mankind? That's been highlighted so vividly in recent days with all that's going on and the violations of this particular spiritual purpose of achieving the oneness of mankind. And then collectively on this planet, it's up to us to take charge of the process of carrying forward the advancement of civilization. Would you read that?
Sure. The Anisa approach. Because humans are both the object and the subject of the educational process, the starting place necessarily must begin with gaining as much knowledge about the nature of the creature for whom the educational system is being designed. To accomplish this requires becoming informed about who we are as human beings, where we come from, and where we are headed in the evolutionary trajectory of life. This requires examining all of the most promising extant perspectives that portend to explicate the true nature of man. I'm going to read the last sentence again. This requires examining all of the most promising extant perspectives that portend to explicate the true nature of man. Could you explain that last sentence for us?
Our nature means what is our purpose? Where have we been? Where are we right now in that trajectory? And where are we headed? That is an open-ended issue that humans must necessarily struggle with throughout existence and throughout the evolutionary process. Whitehead makes the point of saying that reality is what is. Truth obtains when what you understand corresponds to that reality. We never achieve that. But what we can do is get closer and closer to that reality. He also says that we tend to only understand that which we clothe in experience. Let's take the term community. It's a simple word. You can mention that to anybody from any part of the globe, and there will be recognition. And if we only go that far, we assume that we all have the same notion of what community means. But all one has to do is to explore the various cultures, what Dan has called the pattern utilization of energy. That's how he defines a value. And when it's shared by a group of people, we call it a culture. When my wife is Iranian from India. Well, one of the big awakenings for me when we first got married, and I'm sure it's the same for her, was how different the American culture and the Persian cultures are from one another. And then we both had the task, the challenge, and ultimately the delight of seeing how the energy that's available to us is expressed in patterns that represent both cultures. And that's what cultural anthropology is all about. So I remember when an educational deepening program was being developed under the direction of Dan Jordan called a comprehensive deepening program. In the late 60s, early 70s. And the first version of that, before they went to press, this was sponsored by the National Spiritual Assembly of America. They thought before they spend all that money, they better send it off to the House of Justice to get their reaction. And I wish I had asked Dan to let me make a copy for my own file of the House of Justice's response. First paragraph, 3 paragraphs. First paragraph, pat on the back. It's wonderful. It's that you're taking on such a needed and worthwhile task. Second paragraph, in the most delicate and gentle language you could imagine, they leveled and said, "You fellows missed the point." But rather than to leave the team hanging there, the third paragraph gave guidance. Not a prescription, but guidance, generic guidance, in which the House of Justice as an institution wrote, "Let us give you a definition of what deepening means from a Baha'i perspective." And then they quoted the beloved Guardian in which he says, "Deepening from a Baha'i perspective means gaining a clearer apprehension of God's purpose for man." Amazingly abstract, amazingly comprehensive and total, extraordinarily powerful if pursued with the struggle of understanding the deeper implications of that. A lot of things are simple, but most things are not simple. And if we try to make them simple, we do humanity a terrible disservice. It's a process definition as well. One of the things that Whitehead says in his cosmology, he redefines reality as change. There are 2 types of change. There's entropy, a winding down or disintegration, and then there's the opposite of entropy, and that is negative entropy, which means change in the direction of higher levels of complexity that make whatever you're talking about more adaptive to its existence and its environment and its future. So reality is change. That's what development means in the deepest way. It's change in the direction of higher levels of complexity that make the human organism more adaptive to its environment and the conditions that humanity faces. And that's was the key to the Anisa broad definition of reality, of development rather. Development, you know, there are many, many theories of development, and some of which contradict each other and some that go further than others. But development writ large, as discovered by the Anisa model, is the translation of potentiality into actuality. There are two discernible forms of potentiality that humans are capable of ascertaining. One has to do with our physical bodies, and that's the biological potentialities. The key factors are good nutrition, exercise, proper air, and that sort of thing. The higher order potentialities are the psychological potentialities, and that's psychological writ large. And we, in the philosophy of the model, say that human potential, for all practical purposes, is without limits. Well, we introduced a challenge in our conceptualization. If we say a human potential has no limits, then how do you get a conceptual grasp on it in order to develop a model that actualizes potential? And Dan found that an infinitude of potentialities can be organized within a finite group of categories. And so if you look at all the talents, skills, and abilities that human beings are capable of, they fall into these 5 categories. And these are the categories of learning. There's the learning about the voluntary control and utilization of the voluntary muscles. That's psychomotor learning. It's our first learning, creeping, crawling, learning how to interact with the physical environment and gain control, and knowing where we are physically in relationship to the force of gravity. On top of that is perceptual acuity, referred to as the 5 senses, with the heaviest implications for sight and for hearing in education. And then above that is what's the cognitive, and this is where consciousness, thinking come into play. For example, we identify, just in terms of the patterns of thinking that can be categorized under patterns of inference, over 50 different patterns of inferential thinking that human beings can engage in, none of which is taught directly in the traditional program that's based on storage and retrieval of information. And then there's the category that humanistic ed tried to address back in the late 50s, early 60s, and on into the 70s. And that is the organization of our feelings and emotions. We are emotional human beings, and it does have an effect on who we are and what we become. And a person who has a mature affect is in a better position than a person who is underdeveloped or has a distorted affect. If, for example, a child is taught to hate learning, then that hatred, that emotion, undermines the very basis upon which the actualization is allowed to emerge. And then, as I mentioned earlier before, the 5th category has to do with volition, the ability to intend to do something and then actually follow through and complete it with distinction. And so Anisa addresses the issue of how to learn, focusing in on the actualization of these biological and psychological potentialities. The traditional curriculum is quite good in terms of the what's to learn. And that's growing. As I said earlier, that the what's are doubling every 8 months. It's but how to gain access to that information and deploy that information in solving the great issues that are facing humanity, which we're quite well aware of because it's blasted in the newspapers and it's over television every day about the trouble spots. If you put a world map up and just threw a dart at the map, no matter where it strikes, there would be a trouble spot. The earth, mankind is in deep trouble at this point. It's in need of a powerful educational system. There once was a time when storage and retrieval of information was sufficient for humans to eke out an existence. If you look at the various stages that the anthropologists have shown us, the whats were crucial in being able to not only survive, but to survive in a better state than alternative states. We've reached that point, according to Julian Huxley, where that's insufficient. It's time, and we have the capacity now. We have the potential through the evolutionary process, which now, he said, for all practical purposes, physical evolution has come to a standstill. He said 5,000 years from now, humans are going to look pretty much the way we look. But evolution continues nonetheless. It's an evolution of the mind, and I say of the soul. And it's because of that shift, there needs to be a more powerful form of education that recognizes that stage that humanity has arrived at and will provide human beings with the powerful tools to take charge of the evolutionary process and then to direct it. And so that means a shift from an educational program that focuses entirely on the what's to learn to one that emphasizes how to learn. And we find that in order to actualize human potential, to translate human potential into actuality, the process involves an interaction with three powerful environments: the physical environment, which is made up of all things, as well as we include in Anisa the biological level and the animal level and the physical environment. And then we interact with other human beings. That's the human environment. And then there's the environment that can be called either the fiducial, which means trust, or the unknown environment. This comprises the yet to be learned possibilities as well as the ultimate unknowns. And it's through that interactional process, utilizing the symbol systems of math for the physical environment. Language is heavily implicated in the human environment, and with the disciplines, with the what's in the fields of anthropology, sociology, psychology, history. And then when it comes to the unknowns and the ultimate unknowns, both math and language fall short. And humans have the capacity for engaging in what is labeled the arts: music, dance, theater, and so on. The highest hopes and aspirations that humans have engaged in can only be fully expressed and understood through an understanding of the symbol system of the arts. There's no accident that religion has glommed on to the need for beautiful aesthetic cathedrals and some of the beautiful liturgical music and other forms of music, and the field of theater and dance. That avenue of symbolic representation and communication is imperative as humans yearn for knowledge to move beyond where we are at this point in our evolutionary process. So and then there's the environment of the self. We are a combination of those three environments. We're physical. You know, when a human being is born, well, you know, if we look at our physical being, you can go to the drugstore and under $10, you can buy all the chemicals that make up the human body, but you can't put them together and stir them and create a human being. There's a spark of magic that only the creator can bring about. And there's a process during which that's dependent upon, that's utilized in doing that. And at the point of birth, and even before birth, the Anisa model with good nutrition, proper diet of the mother, even before pregnancy, ideally, but certainly during the gestation period. And then that child, there is a time when if there isn't sufficient vitamin C, there are developmental delays and handicaps that are imposed. There are different nutrients that are needed in different proportions at different times. And that's why in the biological aspect of human development, nutrition is crucial. You know, the old adage, what we eat is who we become, really is true. And then above that, the mind and the soul require some form of education, some form of instruction. The question being, what is the best direction to head in to increasingly gain a more powerful means by which that educational process can take place? And that's how Anisa was, that's why Anisa was founded. That's why it's been pursued over all these years. I was with the program for 14 years up until Dan Jordan's untimely death. All of the materials now are, fortunately, through the efforts of very close friends, are archived at Stanford University. And then there's a website that Dr. William Hewitt, who at the time was at Valdosta State University in Georgia, that can be accessed. And everything that's ever been printed on the Anisa model is now available to all of humanity through technology. And that's when that was accomplished, plus the archiving of all the physical pieces of work, the articles and documents and unpublished book and other various training documents. When all of that was archived at Stanford University, I breathed a sigh of relief, because at least what Anisa has accomplished to date has been preserved and now is accessible to humanity whenever humanity chooses to pick up where Dan Jordan and the team left off and benefit from all of that work that's already been done. I am convinced, I have had 46 years in the field of education, that the Anisa model represents a true, legitimate paradigm shift in the educational process. And those educational models that follow necessarily will be headed in the same direction as Anisa has pioneered. Traditional education is largely based on tradition, how to do a tree, and the guesswork of intuitive teachers. There's nothing wrong with the intuitive instinct of teachers. I've seen evidences of brilliant teaching by people who just have the gift of intuitive insight and who, in my words, create educational miracles with their students. But we can't necessarily rely on that as a sole basis for good teaching and good education. It requires a education to be moved off of a tradition of how to do a tree onto a scientific basis as is humanly possible. There will always be dimensions of the educational process that are ultimately aesthetic, and intuitive. But if there is more to be learned about the nature of learning and how best to facilitate that learning at an optimal rate, why not pursue that as a complement to the brilliant teaching that is going on? I've seen it at different places, one of which is the Townsend School in the Czech Republic. I wrote a paper called The Townsend School, A Miracle Story. It's an extraordinary place. Another eyewitness was back in the late 60s, early 70s, called Harlem Prep. Ed Carpenter and Ann Carpenter and Hossein Adieh started a school operating out of an abandoned supermarket. And the students, 92% of them, were off the streets of Harlem. When I visited that place, learning magic was taking place. And they were intuitively gifted educators who set a new direction based on that intuitive instinct. And interestingly enough, 92% of those students at Harlem Prep during that period went on to respectable colleges and universities and graduated from these. Some of those students actually slept in the park. They had no homes to go to. So to match intuitive, brilliant instincts with science is what's needed. And there's another dimension that needs to be mentioned, and that is the actual environment within which the education takes place. And I point to the Townsend School. All you have to do is step on that campus and you can feel a difference. I use the analogy of an alloy. You know, an alloy is a combination of metals, each with its own tensile strength that combine to make a stronger composite. If you use reductionistic thinking, you would think that the amalgam, the combination, would be the average of the strengths of the component metals proportionate to their representation. Whereas in fact, the strength of the alloy is several times the individual strengths of the component metals. Now, where does that moreness come from? And if you disaggregate it, the metals, that disappears. Well, that phenomenon of synergy also can take place in individual, and it has to do with relationships, the quality of relationships, and the sense of purpose and direction and education. And those schools that create that synergy have greater success than the schools that merely represent a collection of individuals who can't wait to get the hell out of there so they can go on with their lives. I call it a quality of moreness. It cannot be fully defined, but you sense it. You sense it in the network of relationships. I have said often, when it comes to real estate, the three most important things are location, location, location. You've heard that over and over again. When it comes to any kind of human enterprise, especially education, the three most important things are relationships, relationships, relationships. We are social, spiritual beings. That's part of our reality. And we are individuals, but we also are people, are entities that long for meaningful connections. And when those connections begin to take place, without necessarily being able to articulate it, but you sense it nonetheless, there emerges what I'm labeling a quality of moreness. It's that quality of moreness on an international scale that I believe the goal of establishing the world order of Baha'u'llah is all about. It cannot happen in the absence of powerful education. There's that quote from Baha'u'llah, regard man as a mine filled with gems of inestimable value. Education alone can cause it to release its treasures. That's a powerful statement. That's the most powerful endorsement of education that I've ever seen in any of the holy scriptures of the great world religions. That's our mandate. That's our charge. Recognizing that being spiritual is not just emotional. It involves all of the categories of potentiality and the orchestration and union of those potentialities in a never-ending process of actualization through education. Educo means, as I said earlier, to draw out, not to stuff in. Education writ large is drawing out what appears to be an endless flow of or existence of human potential. And that's what Anisa is dedicated to. The broad strokes are pretty much in place, and this model awaits young, brilliant, soulful, spiritually oriented individuals to pick up where Anisa and the team left off and to carry it forward as an ongoing process. So that's kind of a summary of what Anisa is all about, actually. Oh, this is a wonderful quote. Would you read that from the Quran? Or no, from the Baha'i writings. It's from Abdul Baha, but there's a quote from the Quran contained within it.
Yes. So here we go. O God, O thou who hast cast thy splendor over the luminous realities of men, shedding upon them the resplendent lights of knowledge and guidance, and hast chosen them out of all created things, this supernal grace, and hast caused them to compass all things, to understand their inmost essence, and to disclose their mysteries, bringing them forth out of darkness into the visible world. He verily showeth his special mercy to whomsoever he will. O Lord, help thou thy loved ones to acquire knowledge in the sciences and the arts, and to unravel the secrets that are treasured up in the inmost reality of all created beings. Make them to hear the hidden truths that are written and embedded in the heart of all that is. Make them to be leaders unto thee, guides unto thy path, runners, urging men unto thy kingdom. Thou verily art the powerful, the protector, the potent, the defender, the mighty, the most generous.
There you have it in a nutshell. How are we on our time?
We are at about the time for questions.
Okay.
So we have enough time for a few questions, like 3, 4, depending on how long they go. So one of the important questions that Regina Colston asked is, how can we find sites where information on the Anisa model can be found?
So far, the two that I've given, the collection at Stanford University, also at the website at Valdosta State, where you can download all the printed material. Also, I don't know how they would access it, but there was a series of World Order magazine when that World Order was published by the Baha'i Publishing Trust, a series done on the Anisa model. And that really represents a comprehensive overview, beginning with philosophy down through development, um, teaching and learning, and evaluation. And so those articles are a good source right there.
Thank you. And hopefully that answers Regina's question, as well as those who are watching this right now that wanted to know where to find these materials. If members of the audience would like to ask a direct question, we have the floor open for questions. The question from me to the audience is, if you could please post your questions on the Zoom group chat, and then we'll give you the floor to ask the question as well. So we have some comments being left as to how to find the materials you were discussing. And there's also an article apparently that you wrote regarding creating spiritual safety zones for children and youth.
Yeah, that's available through BahaiTeachings.org.
BahaiTeachings.org has your article. And
yeah.
Is it related to the Anisa program?
No, I was just asked to do that by David Langness, who at the time was coordinating the articles that were published through that means. He asked me to, and I've known David for quite some time, and he knows about Anisa. And we've stayed in touch over the years. He asked me to do an article, and that's what emerged. I can't overemphasize the importance of the context within which education takes place. There's a difference between that environment of inclusion and the nurturing and the establishment of relationships as a support to the more didactic instructional aspects of the learning process. It's not an either or, it's both. And what emerges is the most extraordinary synthesis of an approach in approaching the educational task. And to whatever degree any school is able to achieve that, the results are pretty astounding.
So there is a question from Susan.
Okay.
And Susan's question directed toward you is whether you know of the Universal House of Justice letter that was sent to Dan Jordan, if it is present with the collection of his papers at Stanford University.
The correspondence that I know of between the House of Justice and Anisa centers largely on a decision that was made in the late 60s by the American NSA. They had made a tentative decision to make the Anisa model the official educational model to be carried out and developed and supported within the Baha'i community. And before they acted upon that decision, they thought they'd better check this out with the Universal House of Justice. And they did. And the House of Justice sent a letter back saying that, advising them not to do that because the resources at that time of the faith were insufficient to adequately support such a venture. And secondly, by then complying with that decision, that freed the Anisa team to go to various foundations and to gain money. At one point, of course, even still, it's a lot of money. At one point, we needed about $300,000 a year just to support our tenured faculty at the University of Massachusetts in the effort. But it also had a spillover benefit. And Dan Jordan realized that right away. It was the guidance that was obviously the guidance that was absolutely needed at that time. Namely, that if they had endorsed it being developed within the faith, there would have been a tendency on all of us, most of us who worked on Anisa were members of the Baha'i, are members of the Baha'i faith, to only look to the Baha'i writings in formulating the theoretical and philosophical portions of the model and whatnot. Baha'u'llah did not reveal a system of education. What he did reveal was a wealth of generative guidance that then could be drawn upon and merged with scientific knowledge to create such a model of education. That forced us to look into the best research that we could get our hands on, developed by the contemporary body of scholars. And because of that, Anisa was able to draw a much broader circle at that point, while at the same time not ignoring basic principles that have emerged, that exist and derive from the Baha'i writings. And it turned out that Anisa represents a fortuitous union in drawing upon the two most important sources of knowledge, namely religious revelation and scientific knowledge. One important and very important principle in the Baha'i faith is the union of science and religion. They've never gotten together until in recent years. Just look at what happened to scholars such as Galileo and Descartes and Copernicus and Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhard de Chardin who wrote The Phenomenon of Man, a brilliant book that I would recommend, which is part of the Anisa library of books to study, to learn about who we are as human beings and where we're headed, was a Jesuit priest. It's speculated that he became a Jesuit because the Jesuits had access to the best colleges and universities and sources of knowledge. Anyway, as he developed science, the church became more and more uncomfortable with what he was saying. And so here's the problem. The leaders of religion have not necessarily been the top scholars, but they do have power. They have had power, even more power in the years past. And whenever they didn't understand something, they repressed whatever the source of that new knowledge is. And that's why they treated Copernicus and Galileo and Teilhard de Chardin and people like that, the way they were threatened, and their very lives were threatened. But intellectuals get carried away. They have egos and they get kind of caught up with themselves. So for the first time in the history of mankind, the groundwork now has been cleared for both religion and science to come together. And my speculation is, by taking power away from individuals, scholars must rely entirely on their ability to discover new knowledge and to explain it and make it in palatable form to the rest of humanity. religious leaders now don't need to feel threatened by concepts and ideas that they don't understand, and therefore felt in the past to use repressive measures to squelch. That simple principle in the Baha'i writings. Individuals do not have power. Power is vested in institutions. They're called assemblies, local, national, and the Universal House of Justice. Humanity now is freed of the barriers that will allow for the scientists and the religious leaders to work hand in hand, for science and religion truly to work in unison. And that is, that sounds simple to say, but that is a major leap forward. And I anticipate that in the near future, quantum leaps on the part of both religion and science will come as a result of the wedding of those two major sources of knowledge. Religion that gives absolute principles, and science that gives us the best approximation of truth as it has been ascertained to date. Science will always just have knowledge that's relative, but it can be more and close with reality, as Whitehead has explained.
So I wanted to actually have Margaret, she had a comment she wanted to give. I wanted to have her, if you could, Jeremiah.
Hi, yeah, this is Margaret. I was a student at Northwestern University in the early 70s. I was a music ed piano major. And when I was doing in the School of Education, I had to write papers and all that. And I focused on the Anisa project. I did a lot of research and did my papers on the Anisa project. I was fascinated by it. And so that's been how I've taught my whole life, is through the understanding that I had of what the Anisa project, on how to learn, and viewing the whole child and the spiritual nature of humanity, and being a Baha'i. But I wanted to just thank you for the work you did there, and for the influence this has had in my life and on my students.
Well, thank you. Let me make this as a postscript to your comment, Margaret. I wandered into education. My undergraduate time was an academic disaster. I won't go into detail. And I was studying a topic that I hated, business, but I didn't know what else to study. So I took a degree in business. I simply thought that, well, if you get a degree in business, you can make some money. Now that's pretty shallow. But I found out my third year that if I took 2 courses in education plus student teaching, I could get a teaching job. I graduated then, I did student teaching. I graduated and never bothered to look for a job. It was late August. I was visiting a friend who was buying an insurance policy. And the insurance agent turned to me after he sold the policy to my friend and said, "Why don't you get one?" And I very flippantly said, "Well, get me a job and I'll buy a policy." He said, "Well, what do you do?" I said, "Well, I have a teaching license." He said, "I'll get you a job." Well, what I didn't know was that he was engaged to the daughter of the mayor of the neighboring town, and they were looking for to hire their first African American as a teacher. And the next morning, I got a call from the superintendent of schools saying, "I understand you're looking for a job." And I kind of stammered. And I said, "Oh, well, yeah." He said, "Come on down to my office," gave me the address. And he asked me a couple of questions, and he put a contract in front of me. And I signed it. And my first teaching job was to teach intermediate elementary mathematics. And I didn't know beans about that. I went in as completely devoid of any training. My student teaching was on the secondary level. My homeroom, my first class in that, it was a 4th grade class. I've soon found out that my 2 best students in math, one had a measured IQ of 138 The second had a measured IQ of 76. They were both the first finished with an assignment, and they both had the highest number of correct answers. The 136, the 138 IQ child came from a very stable home. The youngster who had the 76 IQ, it took me just a few minutes to realize to confine him to a desk that screwed to the floor and a seat that screwed to the floor was an impossibility. His short haircut revealed 4 huge scars on the top of his head, where his father used to beat him with a lead pipe. There was neurological damage. Well, it was obvious to me that to confine him to a desk and chair was beyond his control. So I gave him the accommodation of standing, being able to move around the room if he wanted to hold, get a big pencil, those big primary pencils that he could hold with both hands, and give him newsprint to do his math on. And when he was freed of the limiting conditions that he wasn't able to, with the 8.5 by 11 and conventional pencil, he was a brilliant youngster, but his measured IQ was 76. So I learned to mistrust IQ scores. And then I learned to mistrust, it isn't that they're useless, but they have to be understood rightly. It's only a sample, best an approximation of a person's past, the person's imminence. Then I learned to mistrust using achievement test scores as a predictor of potential. I have asked many test theorists, what's so sacred about the time restraint? And everyone said it allows the test to produce a bell curve distribution. I said, in other words, it's to establish the validity of the test. It has nothing to do with whether the kid knows what he's doing or not. Some people take longer, and they're more deliberate in how they do things. Why should they be punished because they didn't work within a 35 or 40-minute time constraint on an achievement test? Now, achievement tests are useless, but they are at best a sample of the person's past that's been accumulated. They should not be used as a predictor of the future. Brahms dismissed Beethoven as a student at 6 and told his parents he doesn't have the talent to be a musician. Einstein didn't speak until he was 4 years of age. His parents had the wisdom to take him out of the regular German schools and put him in a school that followed the philosophy of a Swiss educationalist by the name of Pestalozzi, where had a lot of hands-on activities and so on. And the stories are replete. You know the story of Helen Keller. There's a moving letter that Helen Keller wrote in 1924 when, by means of the new technology of the day, radio, this individual who could neither see nor hear heard the New York Symphony's performance of Beethoven's Ninth. You can look it up on YouTube, Helen Keller's letter in 1924 to the New York Symphony. When I read what she got from that symphony, I thought, I've heard it several times and I've enjoyed it, and I thought I kind of understood it. I never had the depth of understanding. What happened is somebody from her family took the cover off of the new technology of the day, a radio, and had her put her fingers on the cone of the speaker. And she heard the New York Symphony play Beethoven's Ninth through the vibrations that were received through her fingertips. It's a touching letter. Anne Sullivan was a nurse, the Irish nurse that was hired by the wealthy Keller family to take care of this wild child that could neither see nor hear. And a book was written about the success. It's called The Miracle Worker, followed by a play and then a musical, a movie rather. And by finding an alternative to the usual way of understanding what potentially was genius in this blind, deaf child, found in Anne Sullivan worked to find an avenue for that potentiality to become actualized. And in all of those representations, there's that incredible scene at the pump where Anne Sullivan pumps water over the hand of Anne's of oh, I'm blanking on her name now, Helen Keller, and signed in her palm water. And Helen Keller made the first breakthrough in connecting an experience, namely the water flowing over her hand, and the symbolization of water in the palm of her hand through sign language. And that was the breakthrough that led to a succession of breakthroughs that resulted in the genius of Helen Keller, that the world now knows about it. And the book and play and movie are all called The Miracle Worker. Well, I've said at Harlem Prep and then at Townsend, I told the Townsend people, I said, you know, she is a miracle worker, but the truth of the matter is she only affected one life. I said, you are affecting hundreds of lives. You are miracle workers. That's the goal of the educational process, is to have a training program where the sheer number of educators can be trained to be miracle workers. That is fundamental to the knowing and worshiping God, to acquiring virtue, to achieving the oneness of mankind, and to carrying forward the advancement of civilization. The 4 statements of purpose that we are told as members of the Baha'i faith, we're here on this dust heap of an earth to carry out and to actualize. And that is the big picture and the big goal that Anisa initiated, and I'm hoping that the work that's been done thus far will serve as a foundation for that effort to be continued, and that eventually out of that will emerge an educational program that truly is successful at actualizing the limitless, what seems to be limitless potentialities of humanity.
Don, there is a question that I want to end the talk on, and I think that it's a very important question that we should end this on.
Okay.
The action component. So what is the preferred or proven way to introduce our educators, our modern day educators, to the model, the Anisa model, and to gain their acceptance?
Well, it didn't take us long to realize that good ideas alone are insufficient. There are tons of good ideas that have died on the vine. A powerful idea has to become structured. There has to be it's an issue of spirit and form. Spirit without form runs all over the place. Form without spirit is deadly. Once there is a good idea, then there has to be some form of structure through which that idea can now surface and become accessible to the rest of humanity. So eventually, there has to be the institutionalization of an educational effort whose purpose is to take what Anisa has developed thus far as a basis, as a foundation, and then to continue the research and the study to fully flesh it out into a full educational system that then can be made available for aspiring teachers to be trained in and then to be empowered to provide the best of education for humanity. It has to become institutionalized. And I think there's a timing for everything. We pushed and struggled and to do that, and we're making quite success because, you know, the whole educational program, that's the reason that Dan Jordan and I left the comfort of the tenured positions at the University of Massachusetts to get to join this new university called National University back in those days that hadn't been in existence for very long. We were invited to, they didn't have a school of education, and they made it clear that they didn't want a typical school of education. They wanted something different. And they sensed in Anissa the difference that they wanted. And so that's how Dan and I got hired on to create National University School of Education with all the attendant programs related to it, including a lab school that served as a place for teachers to go and see in process the unfoldment of this powerful educational model. It was cut short by the untimely death of Dan Jordan. Everything came to a screeching halt. I, in a couple of years after hanging around San Diego afterwards, moved my family to Arizona. That's a whole different story. And I couldn't find a job. For a year, I was unemployed. And then I had to decide, did I want to stay in education or not? And I chose to stay, but there were no positions at the university level. In fact, all the universities throughout the nation were in a retrenchment mode because of the poor economy. And so in the senior years of my career, I started all over again as a 6th grade teacher at MacArthur School, excuse me, in Mesa, Arizona. And within 2 years, they trusted me with the principalship of a school, a wonderful school called, who's the, I'm blocking the name of the school. Who was the pilot? See, that's what happens when you get old. Anyway, Lindbergh, and it's named after Anne Morrow Lindbergh, the wife of the pilot. And it was just the kind of school I wanted. It was in a working class neighborhood with a large minority population. And I was there for 14 years, and I couldn't ask for a more wonderful, hospitable, and enjoyable place to end my last 14 years, formal years as in the field of education. And then from at that point on, I got introduced to the Townsend School in the Czech Republic, and I've been visiting the Townsend over those many years, and there are many fond memories related to that. So that's where I am at this point.
On behalf of the Baha'is of Clearwater, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak on this very important subject of the Anissa education model. And hopefully those watching will be able to glean from this and be inspired to learn more. And with that said, Alex, one of the participants, has provided some links as to the sources that you had mentioned. And we, besides, of course, the Zoom group chat, which you can access now, we will be posting that with the videos on YouTube and Facebook, so other people can also look at those sources.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to give it my last shot. I'm not a spring chicken anymore. I'm 85 years old. Anyway.
It was a very beautiful presentation, and it was enough so that someone can use this information and do something with it. So that's the hope, right?
Indeed, indeed. You know,
I-
the it said that there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And I really believe with the resurgence of interest in Anisa, that this very well may be, we may be on the threshold of that powerful idea whose time has really come for a quantum leap forward that will ultimately serve the best interests of mankind.
Indeed, indeed. I hope everyone has a beautiful week ahead. And until next Sunday, we hope you can stay tuned on www.clearwaterbahais.org. Bye.